alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think all of you guys put it well. There is that need. HR is very revolutionary for the masajid. I think a while back, finance department, accounting department was like that. And it's never too late to get started on this kind of stuff. So I do appreciate Brother Shakil kind of inviting me over, and inshallah I can, share whatever little bit that I know that can benefit our communities. Let me just go ahead and get started with, these are some of the things that I want to cover. The purpose of the presentation, what are some of the regulatory agencies that employers need to be aware of, the types of claims that employers run into, the functions of human resources, posters and policies that I'll show you an example of, the difference between exempt and non-exempt employees, the difference between employee and an independent contractor, what are the roles of interns and volunteers, what not to ask in job interviews, and then some of the proactive steps that the organizations can take as a whole. First and foremost, I think we kind of discussed the importance of this type of work. But in a nutshell, employers need to understand the responsibility towards employment practices. There are a lot of laws that we need to be aware of. We also need to identify areas where the organizations need to comply with state and federal laws. There are many. And then help us raise the awareness of the role of human resources in a nonprofit world. Also because there are lawsuits on rise, not just at nonprofits or masajid, but in general. Us being a Muslim organization, we are under high scrutiny at times, especially with media, so any proactive steps would help us out. Also, the employees who are coming into the workforce tend to be younger generations now, and they have an understanding of the system. They know who to call when they have issues at work. So that gives employers that liability to kind of make sure that we are meeting the requirements. California also tends to be an employee-friendly state, which means that if there are issues and employee goes out and complains, the courts and these agencies will lean more towards the employees, not so much towards the employer. Also, I think we need to, as nonprofits, we need to understand that the legal requirements are for nonprofits and for profits. Sometimes we feel like, oh, we're a smaller organization and I don't think anybody will come after us. And that is not the case. If you are a smaller organization, there are some laws that you may not have to be abiding by, but in general, there are requirements that nonprofits have to abide by also. The regulatory agencies, there are various, but I want to cover a few very popular ones. The Department of Labor, also known as DOL, they're responsible for wage and hour standards, unemployment insurance benefits, and re-employment services. The second one is Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They're also known as EEOC. They are responsible for enforcing federal laws that make it illegal to discriminate against job applicants and employees because of a person's race, color, religion, gender, national origin, age, disability, and genetic information. The other few are USCIS, that is the United States of Citizenship and Immigration Services. They look at the legal authorizations for the employees to work in the United States. CalOSHA is California Occupational Safety and Health Association, and they obviously look after the safety of the employees in an organization. I want to discuss some of the claims that the organizations run into, and these are few that kind of are repeated for the organization. Some are very popular than others, but one tends to be the wage and hour claim. The other one is harassment, retaliation, wrongful terminations, emotional distress, workers' compensation, and Discrimination. The discrimination claims tend to be the most common form of employee lawsuits. So, for example, EEOC had received over 90,000 of these claims, these charges in 2013, and they track them on their websites also. An example of, so for example, in these types of claims, there could be in one case or one complaint, there could be multiple different claims. An employee can say that they were verbally harassed by a manager. In it, there could be a retaliation case, and in it could be a wrongful termination case. The employee can say, because I complained for harassment, they retaliated against me and they let me go wrongfully. An example of wage and hour claims. So employers have paid over $1 billion annually in wage and hour claims in the last several years. So this is Department of Labor. They come out and if an employee just basically does a complaint on saying, oh, I didn't get paid for certain hours that I did, I didn't get paid for the overtime that I worked, or the employee says that I didn't get to take the breaks that I was entitled to. These are the types of hour and wage claims that employees report, and then the organizations come out and they investigate, and employers have had to pay billions of dollars on these kinds of cases. There was one case that I quickly wanted to share. It was out of state recently. It's still, I think, pending, but it was a Muslim organization, I think, for profit. It was an auto industry, and the employee was, they agreed that the employee and the employer, the employee would work certain hours, certain days, the pay was arranged, and then employee goes few years later and complains that he worked a lot more hours, he didn't get paid for it. All he had to do was just say it verbally, go out and complain. He didn't have to put anything into writing. The employer tried to provide the documentation, but the documentation was not sufficient. So this, for us, this goes to say that we need to have proper systems in place that the courts will accept. So having said all of that, I want to help you guys understand what is human resources. In a nutshell, human resources handles an employee cycle from beginning to an end. And we have to make sure that we're being compliant and we're having best practices that are out there in the organizations. HR has different functions that we take care of. First one is compensation, very basic. We process payrolls, timesheets. We work very closely with payroll companies to coordinate payroll, insurances. We also make sure that the employees are classified correctly according to their job titles and their duties. HR also handles health insurance, workers' comp, unemployment insurance, holidays, sick and vacations, incentives, retirement plans, etc. Human resources also handles recruitment, so doing job descriptions, posting positions, helping with the interviews, screening candidates, doing onboarding, bringing the employee on board properly, using the applicant tracking systems to make sure that we are tracking the applicant pool as properly as possible, so that way if any cases come on later on, we have the proper documentation. Continuing, human resources also handles employee relations. We, on top of all the other stuff, we get employee concerns. They come out and complain that something happened to them. We need to be able to help them. Do investigations, issue out warnings to the employees, process terminations properly with the right documentation, process performance improvement plans. If an employee is not functioning to the level in certain job area, help them walk through those steps, and then also handling performance evaluations. We also do staff development, where we make sure that we bring on employees as informed as possible through orientations, promotions. We also process promotions, coordinate trainings, and do succession planning. And as we do all these different functions, we have to make sure that HR is being compliant with state federal laws, in policies, in safety, in records and data management. HR also uses what's called human resources information systems. So it's a database that keeps track of employees and all the changes that takes place. Some of the acronyms in human resources, there are way too many and they're way too boring, way too complex, but I wanted to share with you some of them at least to kind of get you to understand what are some of the things that we're working with. ADA, it's in Americans with Disabilities Act. That prohibits discrimination towards people with disabilities. ADEA is Age Discrimination and Employment Act. That is, it prohibits age discrimination, especially for people who are over 40. So they feel like they tend to be discriminated, so then the law came out that we cannot discriminate people against who are over 40 and over. BFOQ is a bona fide occupational qualification. This one is, it's almost like a candidate, an employee having a very special qualification to get into a job. So normally we're told you cannot discriminate people based on certain areas. But here, because we have a very specific, unique need to our organizations, for example, imam positions, Quran teacher positions, Islamic studies positions, you're able to say that you have a need for that very specific requirement, qualification from that employee. So under very, very few small circumstances, you're able to bring in candidates who have what's called bona fide occupational qualification. FMLA is the Family Medical Leave Act. Employers are supposed to give about 12 weeks of time off to employees who have been with in their employment for about a year or so to go out and take care of their pregnancies, their illnesses for themselves and for the family members. And there is certification that's required that employees need to take care of, and employers also. Leave of absence is all bunch of different types of absences that we have to process. Holidays, PTOs, sick leaves, all different types of jury duty, bereavement. I-9 form is a form issued by Department of Homeland Security, and that form is used to verify employee identity in the United States. It kind of confirms the work or authorization status. And this form is supposed to be completed by an employer with some documentation from an employee within 3 years of hiring them. And they're supposed to be, the forms are supposed to be kept in a separate folder, and if an audit happens.
It's supposed to be for full-time employees or
Both. Only independent contractors do not have that. OSHA is, again, they oversee the employee safety, and then if somebody calls and complains that my work is not safe for me, they've got too many wires hanging out, or I have to lift too many heavy weights and they've never given me any kind of training, OSHA will come out and do inspections and then kind of fine the organizations accordingly. Posters and policies. State and federal laws require that employers display posters in public places. So I brought out a sample for you guys if you want to take a look at. It has very basic, yeah, we can circulate it afterwards. This one is expired, but it has very basic laws that the employees are supposed to be aware of. What's minimum wage? What's whistleblowers policy? What are their rights as employees with different kinds of laws? And these posters are supposed to be, your payroll company may provide these to you, either at a reduced cost or for free. So check out, if you have payroll companies, check out with them to see if they can get you those posters. And we're supposed to replace them. Staples, Costco, Amazon, a lot of different places have them. You're supposed to replace these posters once or at least 1 to 2 years, or whenever a certain law changes and they're outdated. And in general, employers have to make sure that we give out policies and handbooks to the new hires, so that way they are aware of what are all the policies. Even if you don't cover every single policy in the handbook, you have handed it to them and they acknowledge that they've received it. Okay, this will be everybody's favorite slide, I think, and the most confusing slide. I wanted to cover the exempt and non-exempt statuses of employees. There tends to be a lot of general confusion in this area, and I hope I do justice to kind of explaining the difference between the two. Every organization will have an exempt employee or non-exempt employee. Salary versus hourly, that's what they're mostly known as. An exempt employee is somebody who is on a fixed salary. They're not entitled to overtime, and their annual salary should be $37,440 per year. That's kind of your mark to decide whether they're an exempt or non-exempt, and usually it's a 2 times minimum wage salary for California employees. On a side note, that may increase as of in January 2016, but that's still at a proposal level. Also, the duties are supposed to be different from the non-exempt staff in a sense that they may be professional, they may require specialized skills, management skills. There is a test that you have to go through when you're deciding whether it's an exempt or non-exempt employee, and this is at a very generic term, but in order for us to decide whether it's exempt, the employee has to pass the salary test and the duties test. So both of them have to match the requirements. Non-exempt tend to be fairly easy, but hard to keep track of because there are a lot of laws that are surrounding the non-exempt employees. We have to make sure that they're paid hourly, they're protected by wage and hour laws. They're also called Fair Labor Standard Act laws. We have to make sure that we track work hours for these non-exempt employees. We have to make sure that we track meals and rest breaks for them, at least the meal breaks. And then they receive overtime. So in California, the overtime is if an employee works more than 8 hours, you are supposed to pay them time and a half. Other states, it's flat 40 hours or more. So this generic test should help us understand whether you're categorizing the employees correctly or not. The difference between,
Also over 40 hours also. Somebody working for
yes, both. Both, so 40 hours and 8 hours. But a lot of us, we may have this understanding that, oh, if they're just working 40 hours or more in California, then we have to pay them overtime. But no, in California, if they work the 9th hour, that's time and a half pay for them in that day. The difference between employee versus independent contractors, you may be familiar with these already, but from what I've seen, I feel like there's this genuine way of really classifying them incorrectly because it just saves a lot of money for the organizations. That's how we see it. So employee really works directly for a company or another person and answers to an employer or a manager. So they have a very specific person that they report to for day to day. Employer also determines the condition and controls the actions of the employee. So what that means is the manager will say, these are the hours that you come in. These are the projects that you have to work on. These are some of your goals for this position. So they have a direct control over the position. As an employee, payroll taxes are withheld from each payment, and then employees receive company benefits, the health, dental, vacation, sick pays, workers' comp, all of those. And then the employee is also protected by workers' compensation insurance that's related to work-related injury or illness that the employee may experience. On the other hand, the independent contractor will also be maybe working for your organization, but they're a bit more independent. They're usually project-based, and they should, if they're classified correctly, they should have some kind of an end date to their project. They are considered self-employed by IRS, and they must pay self-employment taxes. So that's why they fill out that 1099. They receive the 1099 form and they fill out the W-9 form at the beginning of their contract. They are also self-equipped, meaning if you have a project, they bring in their own tools, they bring in their own supplies to get the work done. And the independent contractor has more control over their work as to how they will finish, when they will finish, where will they produce that work. The employer is not in control of the day-to-day of an independent contractor. And the pay rate is obviously by project. If it's by hours, there's a sign that maybe they're an employee. The reason the employers want to identify or bring in independent contractors because they tend to be a bit cheaper on them. But if we have misclassified them, it gets us in trouble a little bit later. There is a lot of gray area, both in exempt, non-exempt, and in employee versus independent contractor. So when you do run into it, do your best to make sure that you are kind of meeting the legal requirements. That's where you always have to lean towards. And then run it by, if you happen to have a legal team, a pro bono support, an attorney that you're paying, run it by them to make sure that, maybe have a project where you're kind of reviewing them on an annual basis to make sure that everybody's categorized correctly. That's a good question. You need to set some standards. There is a lot of gray areas with how much you can utilize the employees. I'd say give them at least 1 day off. I mean, that's minimal that we're supposed to do. They cannot be working 12, 14, 15, 16 hours on a daily basis. That means then you need to reevaluate the position. Those are some of, general. Intern versus volunteers. I wanted to bring this up. I know we don't use a lot of interns, so I don't want to focus too much, but the purpose of an intern is supposed to be that they are there to receive some kind of training based on a specific profession that they have. They are supposed to be working under some kind of a mentor or a supervisor, and the interns are supposed to benefit more from their internship, and the organization is supposed to benefit lesser. So that's a very good check. Sometimes we might be inclined to bring in on an intern and in order to replace an employee. So you want to make sure that you check that you're not doing that, and the intern has to benefit from that program that you have. As far as volunteers, few things. Make sure that you... They are supposed to be within your workers' comp that you have because they have signed off. Get them to sign some liabilities also, just in case. Try not to, if you don't have a very specific internship program, then I would kind of look into that before having interns on board. But make sure that you get them to kind of sign off on some of the liabilities. Volunteers, I brought, where is my, right here. Make sure that we try to get some kind of a liability release from the volunteers if you're going to utilize them. And it's a very basic release saying that I authorize and I will not take any legal actions towards the organization, and it's a voluntary work, and I'm not here to benefit, and I'm there to benefit the organization, not for myself. And I release liability to the organization, and make sure that we train the volunteers on safety, donations. What are the legalities of being able to collect the donations, checks versus cash? Who are they supposed to release the donations to? If you have a database and they're using the database, really, kind of train the volunteers on those, and then also train them on the confidentiality of the work that they will run into. and provide some kind of incentives for them. I feel like we utilize a lot of volunteers, and it's nice to give them some kind of incentive. Sometimes they're customized incentives, sometimes they're not. What not to ask in job interviews. So these are, earlier we mentioned that we're not supposed to discriminate job applicants or employees. So when you are interviewing candidates, make sure that we're not addressing, we don't have any questions that refer to the candidate's race, color, religion, gender, age, pregnancy status, national origin, language, marital status, do you have kids? Sometimes we can get very informal and say, hey, you have kids. Yes, I have got kids too. Don't invoke any information. If they do share it with you, if they start, just kind of trying to wean them off of that topic and make sure you go back to the proper discussion. But do not try to find more information on any of these categories. Military status and on disability specifically. There is supposed to be a question on the job application where you can ask, can you perform essential functions of the job with or without accommodation? And if they have marked yes, you're supposed to flag that for yourself, and in the job interview or later on, you can ask them, what are some of the accommodations you need? Sometimes it might be, just something very small, like, a certain type of a keyboard, or like a little bit of a hearing aid if they have a certain position. If it's too cumbersome for the organization to accommodate, you'll have to, and the applicant is very much qualified for the position, you'll have to somehow do a documentation that you're not able to accommodate this person who is disabled, yet they're able to do the essential functions of the job. Some of the proactive steps that employers can take is make sure, kind of, maybe I brought in this packet that I found, and it discusses how board members can have skills in human resources, some kind of experience in human resources, and that may be very valuable for the organization because they bring in a certain skill set. The understanding of state and federal laws, compliances, best practices out there. So in the communities, if we happen to know, tap into the skill set and have, and I can pass this around. Brother Shaquille said he will also have this posted on the Shura. Some of the other proactive steps are train the managers on basic payroll practices. What are the do's and don'ts of filling out timesheets? Is the employee supposed to, is the manager supposed to, deduct certain hours? No. Is the manager supposed to deduct the breaks? Like, make sure that they have an understanding of what the do's and don'ts are in the payroll practices. Train managers on basic employment laws. Train the managers on harassments and discrimination prevention. Employers should make sure that you have workers' compensation insurance in place. If you have contractors who are on your facility, make sure that they provide you the workers' compensation for themselves, and if they have their own employees, that make sure that they are covered. Some of the organizations have what's called employee practices liability insurance. So this would protect organizations if there are lawsuits that come about from employees. The other one is directors and officers insurance, which may be part of your workers' comp insurance already. If not, you should look into it. Obviously, use the employee handbook for policies. Refer to them. What really helps out is that if there is a certain situation that occurred with an employee, go and reference that to the employee, and usually that kind of resolves it. An employee kind of understands that, oh, it's already there. Maybe I didn't look at it at the time, but somebody brought it to my attention. So kind of refer to them. Documentation. I've sensed that we tend to be very less in doing documentation. Anything from basic documentation to documentation that may arise as of issues with the employees. So, things like having proper orientation process that has an entire packet of the I-9 forms, the W-4, the W-9 forms, policies that employees have signed. What are their rights as far as taking breaks? What are their rights if they were to get hurt? If you have shared all this with the employees, they're well informed, and that's a documentation. If you're going through investigations, write things down as much as possible, even if it's just a handwriting, even if it's just emails that are saved into a certain folder. This kind of stuff really comes back and bites the employers. Even if it's electronic or paper document, one of the things that I do is create employee files. Anything and everything, just stick it in there. If you're not sure, just stick it in there. In general, you're supposed to save the documentation anywhere from 1 year to 7 years on employment practices. This varies depending on the type of documentation. There's a list, and each list has, the time frame. But in general, if you tend to save the documents for about 3 years, you're on the safe side. But again, you need to kind of do your homework, check to make sure which documentations are supposed to be retained for longer than 3 years. So make sure, don't go home and shred everything that's beyond 3 years. Last but not least, establish job descriptions and performance evaluation process. I feel like I cannot emphasize this one enough. And our types of organizations, we bring in employees and we kind of, we don't lay out a lot of structure for the employees. We just kind of let them loose, let them figure out, let them kind of identify what jobs they have. I think the employers really have a responsibility to help the employee understand what their role is. And when we take it from that angle, there is an awesome performance that employees are supposed to produce, and there's this very nice balance that the employees play with the employers. So, for example, a basic process of the employee evaluation process is come up with basic job descriptions. What are your day-to-day works? What are your long-term goals? And what are the requirements for the position? Once you've gone through that, have some of the goals for the employees, 3 to 4 goals that they're supposed to work on an ongoing basis and with long-term projects. And then as a result of that, create like a performance sheet and give them the evaluation once a year, twice a year. And this process is very painful for the managers. You loathe it to a very heavy extent, but don't make it be it's so cumbersome on you. Let it be a feedback process. Let it be a communication and collaboration process. So if you meet up every quarter and say, hey, this is my feedback, stick a sheet in the employee file and say, we had a light conversation, these are some of the things you're supposed to work on. So then it's not so heavy at the end of the year when you're doing the actual performances. So my last slide on the proactive steps is probably very helpful. Right here. One of the things that I run into when I am trying to help the organizations understand the legal requirements is the managers don't understand the seriousness of it, because we have not run into a major situation. And to some extent that is okay, but if you have that help and support, I think what the board can do is perhaps, kind of line out for the operations managers, line managers, to help them understand that they need to kind of come on board. And that's where sometimes that friction, that not understanding between compliance, because they're used to kind of doing things as they have been. It's that cultural shift. It takes a lot of energy. And if we were kind of, just on board with that, so maybe start training the managers on what their responsibilities are as a manager. Managers do a lot of HR work. they may not realize it, but they do a lot of HR work. And if they just kind of take a step forward and kind of understand the compliance, payroll practices, discriminations, harassments, performances, you may not need HR for another few more months. And the other one is, I think that while back, our types of organizations were kind of identifying the needs to have some kind of accounting finance person, in the office, because, we deal with money and donations and tracking. But now that the organizations are growing, you need to have the compliance in process. Yeah. Jazakallah khair. I appreciate, inshallah, I've done justice to your time.